David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So we finally have the scoring from the Congressional Budget Office for this new Trump Republican tax plan. And it's basically exactly as I told you, which is that it is going to add an insane amount to the debt over the next 10 years. We did sort of like a full analysis of the Donald Trump Republican tax proposal. We looked at tax brackets, which are a big part of it. We looked at how deductions would change. We looked at the personal exemptions, which is another part of it. We talked about the repeal of the estate tax, how pass-through income would be differently taxed. We looked at all of that stuff. And as I kind of told you last time, if everybody gets a tax cut, or if most people get a tax cut, especially the rich people, and you don't create new revenue and you don't drastically cut spending, you're going to add to the deficit. And the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, usually for Trump, if it's Obama who has something scored by the CBO is in the tank for Obama. You can't trust the CBO. If Trump is president and the CBO says something good about a Trump proposal, then all of a sudden the CBO is very trustworthy again. But of course, as soon as a Trump proposal or a Republican proposal that Trump likes is scored not favorably by the CBO, as happened with Trump Care 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, then the CBO is bad again. But in any case, the CBO is a nonpartisan entity that scores proposals. They have scored this, and they have indicated that the latest version of the Trump Republican tax cut plan, tax reform plan, will add a staggering 1.7, not million, obviously, not billion, but $1 trillion to the debt over 10 years if it passes. And that's how these bills are measured, over the impact on the deficit over 10 years. The math of it is pretty simple, right? Which is revenues would be cut by 1.4 trillion as a result of the tax bill. And then the cost of servicing debt would up the total deficit increase of the bill by $1.7 trillion. I read a separate analysis which pointed out that of the $1.7 trillion, 10% of that alone would be because of the estate tax change, which means that 10% of this deficit addition is for not the 1%, but the top 0.2%. I told you when we did our analysis of the tax plan that because there's already a $5.5 million per person exemption in the estate tax, or an $11 million per couple exemption. What we are talking about is the richest 0.2% of Americans that would benefit from the change to the estate tax that's proposed. And that alone represents 10% of the deficit increase from this bill. So where is the deluge of fiscal conservatives and small government whatevers coming out of the woodwork, furious that this is going to explode the deficit? You can take a position if you want that the debt doesn't matter. But if that's your position, you have to take it no matter who's president and no matter whether the debt or deficit are increasing as a result of tax cuts for the rich or social welfare programs. You can't only be against increases to the deficit when it's Obama proposing something that would increase the deficit. By the way, he reduced the deficit, but okay with deficit increases if the proposal is from a Republican or for Donald Trump. So you have to prepare yourself for the spin from the right, all this. They'll say, hold on a second, liberals, you never cared about the debt before, so why do you all of a sudden care about the debt and deficit now? That's a red herring. It's not that the left is against this tax cut proposal because of the deficit specifically. It's because, number one, this tax cut proposal is unethical because it is a total crony capitalist handout to the richest Americans, as usual, at the expense of poor and middle income Americans. And number two, because this tax cut proposal is going to further increase income inequality while giving tax cuts to people who are not going to take the money they save and use it to stimulate the economy. So really good reasons to be against this tax cut are it's unethical, it's immoral, and it's bad for the economy. But it is still 100% valid to point out that by the right's own standards, they should be against this tax cut proposal because of the deficit exploding effect that it's going to have. It's not a double standard by the left. it's accurately pointing out the double standard from the right, okay? So prepare for that red herring that you're going to hear from the talking heads and the pundits and everybody else. It's almost boring and passé, though, right? There's nothing shocking about tax cuts for the rich blowing up the deficit. The George W. Bush tax cuts for the rich did the exact same thing. This is just what happens when you cut taxes for the rich. This is why the simplistic talking points around taxes from the right are so destructive. And we'll be having some debates on the program about taxation sooner than later. They create these simple narratives. They take a really complex issue like taxation and they reduce it to, hey, taxes are bad because it's your money. You should keep your money because it's yours. Eliminate as many taxes as possible. Okay, but hold on a second. You don't want to pay taxes and you don't want to increase the debt, but you also want a stronger and stronger, meaning bigger and bigger military, but you don't want to pay taxes and you don't want to increase the debt, on and on in this dumb, vicious circle. So it doesn't make any sense. And along these lines, I want to prepare you for another talking point that you're going to hear, which originated with Trump. Trump has said, and he might say again, that the scoring by the CBO doesn't take into account all of the increased revenue for the government from the new wages and production of stuff and hiring of people, because these tax cuts will cause growth. Do not fall for it. There is no evidence whatsoever, period, that they can point to. It has never worked that way. It will not work that way. No serious economic analysis tells us that the tax cuts are going to generate such significant new government revenue that it's all going to work out to even in the end. It's not going to happen, okay? And while we're at it, one other thing that is sort of starting to circulate, there are some right-wingers tweeting, posting online that this is better than Obama because Obama added 9 trillion to the debt over 8 years, and that this is only 1.7 trillion over 10 years, so it's not quite as bad. This 1.7 trillion that's going to be added to the debt over 10 years, that's just the impact of this tax bill, right? It doesn't include everything else that's going on that will add to the deficit. Remember, Obama reduced the deficit, but it was still positive. So the debt went up, not as quickly as before, but it still went up because we were running a deficit, a smaller deficit. And of course, the debt is the sum total of prior deficits or surpluses that have been run. Republicans are somewhere in the neighborhood of adding 1.2 trillion to the deficit already, running a 1.2 trillion dollar deficit already. This per year, this will add to that. So don't be tricked by that, okay? Be prepared for the talking points, and we'll definitely be following the path of this totally abortive tax plan through committee for you, and we'll report on if and when it will pass. Now, let's talk about that next, okay? Is this Republican Trump tax proposal going to pass? Republicans really need this proposal to go through. Trump desperately needs the proposal to go through just to put something on the board that he might call a legislative accomplishment. Repealing Obamacare has failed 3 times. The travel ban has failed multiple times. Building the wall with Mexico that Mexico is going to pay for, I mean, that's laughable at this point, right? So Trump needs this and Republican needs it. And one problem, kind of a major problem, is that the bill is a disaster, right? I already told you earlier in the show how the bill is going to explode the deficit. It's a handout to the rich. It's an extra big handout to the extra rich. It already appears to be delayed, though. The goal was get the tax cut program, the tax reform plan, through the respective House and Senate committees, conference the bill, come up with a final version that both the House and Senate agree on, vote on it, and pass the thing by the end of the year. The problem is, and the LA Times has a really good story on this, the problem is that the Senate isn't going to be able to do everything that's in the bill. Later today, we're expecting the final Senate version of this bill. But the Senate has this thing, this rule. It's a really inconvenient rule that they have, where they can't pass something that would increase the deficit by more than $1.3 trillion. I'm sorry, by more than 1.5 actually trillion dollars over a decade. And you might be saying, well, hold on a second. Republicans are all about reducing the deficit, not increasing it at all, why are they even considering a tax cut proposal that would increase the deficit? Well, because that's what they do, right? They want to cut taxes for the rich. That increases the deficit. As long as it's not increasing the deficit for social welfare programs, increasing the deficit is okay for Republicans. But the Republicans in the Senate do have this issue. It's a limit that they're up against, and they're basically going back to the drawing board. One Republican official said a couple of days ago, quote, "Everything is on the table. Everything is on the table." So there's a couple different things that Senate Republicans might do to this bill to change it and get it under the addition of 1.5 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. One is they could repeal the state and local tax deductions federally 100%, right? Now, this is particularly bad for a high tax state. So California is an example. Illinois. I actually don't know where Massachusetts falls in terms of tax compared to other states. I assume it's certainly near the top. So that would directly hurt blue states relative to red states, because normally at the federal level, you're able to deduct the taxes that you pay at the state and local level and pay less in taxes federally. If you're in a state with higher taxes and you can no longer deduct those, it is disproportionately going to hit blue staters, for example. That's one thing that Republicans in the Senate could do to try to reduce the deficit increasing amount of this proposal. Another part would be lower the income threshold for when you enter the 39.6% bracket. The highest tax bracket federally under this proposal would be 39.6%. If you lower the income threshold at which you start paying 39.6%, that would reduce the amount that the proposal would add to the deficit. You could choose to retain parts of the estate tax in contrast to the version that's out there right now. And of course, Old Faithful is you can try to repeal parts of Obamacare that cost money, but we saw how that went a couple of times already. So eventually, the Senate is going to figure it out, and we're probably only hours from hearing that proposal for the Senate. So why is there going to be a delay, you might be thinking? If this can be dealt with today by the Senate, that's fine. Move on and vote on it. The problem is that the House Republicans aren't going to go for it, right? The House Republicans want the bill as originally written. And as often is the case, and we've been covering these proposals for years, we'll end up with a conflict between the sort of more extreme and ideologically committed House Republicans and the marginally less extreme and slightly more realistic Senate Republicans who have some more restrictions on what it is they can get away with. I'm actually kind of split on this bill because on the one hand, this would be a great bill for me, right? It would increase the standard deduction. I usually take the standard deduction rather than itemizing my deductions. It would reduce income tax on pass-through business entities. The David Pakman Show is an S corporation. I'm an owner of that S corporation. So reducing the tax rate on pass-through income would be really, really good for me. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, it's a completely immoral handout to people who not only don't deserve this, but it won't stimulate the economy to give these people more money. So I'm really torn. I'm just kidding. I'm not actually torn. Although I would benefit from this. I'm against it. I'm absolutely against it. I think it is utterly terrible. And it also contradicts what Republicans say matters, which is not increasing the deficit. It contradicts what Trump himself said he would do, which is mostly help the middle class, and that his rich friends were going to be angry with him. Turns out his rich friends love it. Turns out that the richest members of Trump's own cabinet and staff would save billions of dollars as a result of the changes to the estate tax. So no, even though I would benefit from this, I don't think it's the right proposal. I am against it, and I'm curious to hear from you. I'm on Twitter at @dpakman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Lance Van Valen. Lance Van Valen. Say that 5 times fast. Thanks so much for being a David Pakman Show member. Of course, you can sign up and join Lance at davidpakman.com/membership. There's a coupon code available. It'll save you 40%. That code is IVoted17. And you can also make a contribution via Patreon. Patreon has been on fire the last week. Not only did we surpass this long-awaited 2,000 patron threshold, we are, as of right now, at 2,062 patrons, and you can access the bonus show and the commercial-free show with as little as a $5 or $10 contribution on Patreon. So check out membership, check out Patreon, and also we now accept cryptocurrency. Find out more at davidpakman.com/cryptocurrency. Our Reddit discussion forum now has nearly 5,000 of our viewers and listeners there. I was on the Reddit discussion forum this morning. Some really interesting discussions there. You can find it at davidpakman.com/Reddit. And I wanted to point out just a couple of these for you that I found pretty interesting. First and foremost, a discussion about whether the Democratic Party should drop gun control from their platform. And it's a post that kind of reflects a discussion we had a little bit with Bill Scher a month or two ago, which is that it may not be advantageous for Democrats to run on gun control, or what I call gun safety regulations, partially because it seems that there's not going to be much movement on that. Even after the Sandy Hook shooting, with something like 90% support in the public for full background checks, President Obama still wasn't able to get that passed. So if it can only hurt you, and it's unlikely that we are going to see movement, maybe Democrats should step away from running on gun control. Another idea from the David Pakman Show Reddit discussion forum: what about banning private banking? Banning private banking. There is a very interesting discussion about this, and a really good case made. Of course, it would never, ever, ever happen, given how much control the banking industry has over our elected officials, Democrat and Republican alike, but an interesting discussion nonetheless. An interesting post with a link to an interview of white separatist, white nationalist Richard Spencer by an African British reporter. Very interesting interview, and I encourage you to participate in that discussion, which a lot of people are finding very interesting, comparing and contrasting my interview approach when I interviewed Richard Spencer to that of this British reporter's, and it's a very interesting interview. I encourage you to check that out. And then a nice little post asking whether David Pakman is oddly soothing. A poster at davidpakman.com/Reddit pointed out that my coverage of the horrible Texas shooting story, while wearing my hair in that crazy, wacky way that I did, was soothing in some way. So, hey, listen, I appreciate it. Any way that I can soothe or relax the audience, I will. I appreciate, including boring people so much that they listen to the show in order to fall asleep. Yeah. Haven't gotten one of those emails lately, but I used to get them all the time. Maybe I'm more agitated now in the Trump era, so I just don't have as relaxing of a cadence or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, I invite you to join the Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. The November 1st enrollment window started for health insurance plans for 2018, and this includes, of course, Obamacare exchange plans. This includes private marketplace plans, all sorts of insurance plans you can now enroll for 2018 as of November 1st. And I was pleased to see that here in Massachusetts, health insurance so I buy my insurance through the individual market exchange of the state of Massachusetts, since I'm self-employed, right? I'm in the individual market. I was pleased to see that my premium is only going up by $6 per month in 2018. And I was prepared for a major increase. And I guess partially because we're in the more progressive state of Massachusetts, I'm a little bit more insulated from the deliberate sabotaging of Obamacare and of the individual market that's been done by Trump's administration and Republicans in the House and Senate. I really was prepared for something much worse, and I really can't complain with a $6 a month increase, just $72 extra for the entire year. Interestingly, though, even though we continue to hear these nightmarish sort of horror stories from Republicans about what a disaster Obamacare is, despite, of course, the fact that it's their attempts to make it a disaster that are making it so, a record number of people signed up for Obamacare in the first few days of the month compared to the same period in 2016. Sources close to the Obamacare sign-up process told The Hill, and this was actually confirmed by a Trump administration official, that over 200,000 people selected plans just on November 1st alone. That's roughly twice the number that did it on November 1st last year for 2017 plans, and traffic on November 1st to healthcare.gov was up about a third, from 750,000 last year up to 1 million this year. And these numbers are particularly notable because remember that the Trump administration has cut funding for Obamacare-related outreach by not 10, 20, or 30%, but by 90%. The Trump administration has also cut grants to groups that help people enroll in Obamacare plans. And still, we are seeing these huge numbers. Now, part of it could be that as part of their sabotage attempts, or sabotage, to quote the great William Shatner, enrollment this year is ending on December 15th. So the Republicans, in part of this ongoing effort to make Obamacare fail, they've shortened the enrollment period, which mathematically would increase the number of people who sign up per day because you've got fewer days to sign up. But I will remind you that Standard & Poor's predicted that enrollment for next year would be about 1.6 million below 2017 enrollment. And President Obama sent out a shockingly, really surprising tweet about Obamacare on November 1st, where President Obama posted, "Starting today, you can sign up for 2018 health coverage. Head on over to healthcare.gov and find a plan that meets your needs." And you might be wondering, well, David, what's so shocking about that tweet? What's shocking and weird is seeing a president or former president tweet without including either a personal attack, misspellings, or bad grammar, or self-serving bragging, right? Just a simple statement of undeniable fact, which is, hey, it's November 1st, you can now enroll for 2018. I found that really stunning in the era of Trump tweeting, kind of like refreshing and a breath of fresh air, in a way, I guess I would say. Is it possible that the horrible proposals from Trump and Republicans to replace Obamacare with terrible things have actually worked to make more people realize, hey, this actually isn't that bad. I'm now more interested in getting one of these plans. It could be an example of the Streisand effect. Streisand effect is named such for Barbara Streisand, where I believe it was about 14 years ago in 2003. Pictures, some kind of paparazzi took pictures of her huge mansion in Malibu, California. And the pictures themselves might not actually have gotten that much attention, but Barbara Streisand went so bonkers trying to suppress the pictures that became news, and it ended up giving much more attention to the pictures than otherwise ever would have been paid to them. Could be a similar thing, right? Trump and Republicans, by trying to repeal Obamacare time after time with horrible replacement ideas, have actually shown people, maybe, that those plans aren't that bad, and maybe they're worth signing up for. We'll wait and see what the final numbers are. We will know, I guess, in a little more than a month, right, on December 16th. The Trump presidency has been many things, many terrible things, as our president likes to say. But one of the things that it's been is what I call a swamp job. Trump ran on draining the swamp, right? Getting the influence of lobbyists out of government. And he claimed that he was going to do it. He claimed he was going to get rid of not only the lobbyists, but the crony political deals. He was going to get rid of all that bad stuff. He's actually done the opposite, right? He's filled the swamp more than any president in recent history. And the Daily Beast did a very interesting examination. It looked at the 341 Trump nominations only for positions that have to be confirmed by the Senate, right? That's the universe of nominations and appointments that the Daily Beast looked at. And what the Daily Beast found is that 179 out of 341 Trump nominations, more than half, had conflicts of interest of some kind. 31% of the nominees, I guess I would call them, worked in the industry that they were supposed to be regulating, and 20% lobbied for or were lawyers for or represented industry members of the industry they were being nominated to regulate. 11 of the 341 actually received payments or campaign donations from members of the industry that they were supposed to be regulating. This is a phenomenon called regulatory capture. Okay, regulatory capture it's a political concept. It is a political concept, and regulatory capture, defined, is a form of government failure that occurs when a regulatory agency created to act in the public interest instead advances the commercial or political concerns of special interest groups that dominate the industry or sector it is charged with regulating. Now, you might be hearing me say this, and you might be thinking, and I know that some of you right-wingers will say this, you'll say, wait, David, of course the people that are being nominated to regulate these industries are from those industries. You become an expert in an industry by working in it. If you're going to regulate that industry or members of that industry, it makes sense. You need people with knowledge of the industry. We should want this. The problem with that argument is that Donald Trump himself made a huge deal out of stopping what he described, right, as the revolving door of people going back and forth from working in private industry, lobbying for that industry, regulating that industry as part of an administration, back to lobbying or working in the industry directly. Trump himself said that he wasn't going to be hiring the lobbyists and the corporate insiders and these types of people. So if your argument is, oh, this is no big deal because everybody does it, then did you believe that Trump was lying when he promised not to do this exact thing? But there's a further issue here, right? Which is there's a difference between being knowledgeable in the industry you're going to be regulating, right? We could say, well, you could look to academics, right? Academics would be very knowledgeable in many of these industries, right? They're not all academic disciplines, but many of them are. But the academics would be far less likely to have the conflicts of interest. What we are really pointing out as a problem here, and what the article from the Daily Beast is pointing out as the issue, is that there are financial conflicts of interest here. More than half of them have those. Absolutely horrifying. And again, if you aren't worried about this, did you not care about it when Trump said he would drain the swamp? Or did you assume that he was lying to you and you don't care that he's a liar? I'm curious to hear from Trumpists what you think about this. You can also discuss this not just with me, but with other David Pakman Show viewers and listeners on our Reddit discussion forum, okay? davidpakman.com/Reddit. I am there, Pat is there, and almost 5,000 of our viewers and listeners are there, so check it out.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Dr. Jeff Szymanski, who's currently the executive director of the International OCD Foundation. Jeff was previously the director of psychological services at McLean Hospital's OCD Institute. He's also author of the book, The Perfectionist's Handbook, and serves as a clinical instructor in psychology at Harvard Medical School. So, Jeff, let's start sort of at the top. When we talk about OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, there's a lot of sort of layperson's terms that are thrown around about what that is and what the symptoms are. But what are we talking about when we talk about OCD?
Yeah, so in the way that you just said, the best place to start is to define some of those terms. Because the way people use, for example, obsession in lay conversation is different than how we use it in psychology and psychiatry. So obsessive in general conversation means I'm obsessed with my favorite baseball team. I'm obsessed with the color purple, meaning I really like something. That's how we use it. When we use the word compulsive in everyday language, we're talking about people that are neat, people that are very detail-oriented, people that are perfectionistic, right? So the problem with those two terms in lay language, having the same words in the title of OCD is that everyone gets them confused, right? So they say, oh, I'm a little OCD because I'm obsessed with having my sock drawer compulsively arranged. And so what happens for people with OCD is they hear that and they're like, oh, you just don't really understand or get my experience. Because in the context of obsessive compulsive disorder, obsession means unwanted, intrusive thoughts and images, things I don't want to be thinking about, things I don't want to be seeing in my mind. And they create a lot of unwanted feelings, primarily anxiety, but also guilt, disgust, other kinds of feelings that a person with OCD doesn't want to have. So these obsessions actually turn up in a lot of frequency and a lot of intensity. And so as the anxiety increases and the unwanted feelings, the unwanted thoughts increase, the person feels compelled to engage in compulsive behavior. Now, the compulsive behaviors are repeated behaviors you're doing internally. So it could be counting or praying or saying a good word over and over again in order to keep yourself safe. Or it could be external behavior. So a lot of people have seen the cleaning and hand washing, et cetera, but there's a lot of different kinds of compulsions that can range from having to do things in a certain number of times, or also just kind of avoiding certain situations that would evoke the obsessions and the anxiety. So the difference between someone being obsessed with their baseball team and someone having OCD is that someone with OCD actually is suffering on a day-to-day basis. And the anxiety and the obsessions and the compulsive behavior are time consuming, and they're getting in the way of day-to-day activities. So people are showing up late to work, or they can't work. They can't get their schoolwork done. They're not being able to see family members or friends that they'd like to be able to see. So again, the D in OCD stands for disorder, meaning that the person's day-to-day functioning is significantly impaired.
How prevalent is OCD in the sense that you're describing it in American society, world? I mean, do we have, probably world is tough because there's so many countries where we just really wouldn't have data, but maybe in the US?
So in the US, this has been shown several times that at any given point, about 1% of the adult population has OCD, and which translates into about 2 to 3 million adults right now would qualify for an OCD diagnosis. Another 500,000 to 1 million kids would also qualify for an OCD diagnosis. In fact, we do have a number of studies worldwide, and that same prevalence of OCD stays consistent across country, that it's about 1% of the population.
Now that's interesting where you say it's consistent across countries, because one of the things I wanted to discuss was whether OCD is a sort of modern Western condition, in the sense that if we were to go back 100,000 years or something like that in human history, do we know anything about the prevalence of OCD or something like it? Or is it really something that has been sort of created or a result of modern Westernization?
So we know from neuroimaging studies, actually, that there are some brain abnormalities for people that have OCD. We know from genetics research that about 1 in 4 kids that have a parent with OCD will have OCD. So there's a genetic transmission, there's a neurobiological component to this. The way that people have talked about OCD and other mental illness historically is looking at autobiographies that people wrote, or biographies where people had written about them. Vincent van Gogh, I think, was an example of someone who likely suffered from bipolar disorder. So the idea that it's a modern, kind of a modern manifestation of something about our society, probably not so much. I think mental illness has been around for quite a while. And to this day, what we still hear people say is, I had OCD for many years. I just didn't have a name for it. I didn't know what it was. So I think that was the case historically, is that someone was behaving in an odd way and reporting being very distressed, and they just didn't have a name for it.
You talked about some of the examples of what are actual OCD symptoms. Are there examples of symptoms attributed to OCD that aren't really OCD symptoms?
I think it probably goes in the other direction, where a number of people in our community find is that they were misdiagnosed with something else rather than OCD. So, for example, some people with OCD will have violent thoughts, and they're thoughts that they don't want to have. It isn't, I had a thought of harming someone and I think I might do it. It's the exact opposite. They're so concerned that they had the thought that they now start policing their mind. Oh my goodness, if I have this thought again, this is a terrible thing. I'm a terrible person. And then they start engaging in all this compulsive behavior to make their mind not think these thoughts. Again, they're not a violent person. They've never committed any violence in the past. And so what happens is that their compulsive behavior increases. They go and report this to a mental health professional who may not know about this form of OCD, and they start to think of them as a potential violent risk. Same thing with sexual thoughts. There's some people that have unwanted sexual thoughts. And if they go to a mental health professional who doesn't know anything about OCD, they might think, oh, maybe this person has some sort of sexual disorder, or maybe they're at risk for harming other people. And so we don't have so much other things get confused with OCD. It's that OCD actually gets uh, uh, not thought of and misdiagnosed quite frequently. A lot of folks that I worked with would be diagnosed with psychotic illness like schizophrenia, because sometimes the obsessions can be very bizarre. But the person knows that the thoughts are bizarre, and that ends up being one of the primary differences.
What constitutes treatment for OCD? Can it be treated effectively? Are pharmaceuticals the answer? Is it something else?
So unfortunately, the recent research is showing it takes somewhere between 14 to 17 years between onset of OCD symptoms and actually accessing effective treatment. And one of the many problems with that is that there is effective treatment. And so there's a class of medications called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, more commonly thought of as antidepressants, but they have anti-OCD properties as well. And so for many people with mild to moderate OCD, they go to the psychiatrist or primary care physician. If they've been diagnosed with OCD and they get on an SSRI, that might actually be the treatment of choice for them. There's lots of research showing that these medications can be helpful for OCD. However, the primary treatment that we refer people to is called exposure and response prevention therapy. And I liken this to if you know someone who's afraid of dogs, what's the best way to get someone over their fear of dogs? You have to expose them to being around dogs. So it's basically the same, kind of in an oversimplified fashion. It's basically the same idea with OCD, is that we actually have the person purposely think about the obsessions and put themselves in contact with situations that would evoke anxiety. And then we ask them to not engage in the compulsive behavior. And so when you break that link of having anxiety and then responding to it with compulsive behavior, and you now kind of cut that off, what happens is the person will continue to experience the anxiety. And what your brain does then is says, oh, wait a minute, this thing that I categorized as possibly dangerous maybe isn't as dangerous as I thought it was. And so then your brain starts to decrease its anxiety. And so we call this habituation. And so you get used to being in a certain situation. And over time, if people use exposure response prevention therapy, they expose themselves to anxiety in situations that evoke their obsessions. They don't engage in the response prevention, they don't engage in the compulsive behavior. What they find is that their anxiety over time decreases and they can approach more situations.
Absolutely fascinating. The book is The Perfectionist's Handbook. We've been speaking with the book's author, Dr. Jeff Szymanski, who is currently the executive director of the International OCD Foundation. Thanks so much for talking to us about this.
No problem. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Hey, here's something a little different. In the context of the Trump-Russia investigation and the indictments that we've been seeing and talk of impeachment, resignation, maybe someday criminal charges against Donald Trump, there's a question that's come up now a handful of times from people in the email and in comments online, which is, what about an insanity defense? Is it possible that Donald Trump, if he were at some point to be indicted or charged for who knows what, and we're thinking ahead quite a bit here, could he maybe get away with an insanity defense? And why would people even be asking about that, right? Maybe part of it is that we've talked about Donald Trump showing some signs, maybe early signs of dementia or Alzheimer's, which of course aren't mental illness. They're disorders of the brain, but certainly they affect mental health and sort of whether you are cognitively able to carry out a job. But let's think through it a little bit, because I think it's an interesting question. The first thing to know and to be aware of is that at the top level, insanity defenses, number one, are really rare. And number two, even when used, they tend not to work, okay? Similarly to how we hear a lot about terrorist attacks and people think that they're more likely than in reality, we hear stories about insanity defenses, but the truth is that, at least according to one study I looked at, number one, under 1% of all cases even attempt an insanity defense. And when it's used, it works, meaning, it leads to a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, only about 1 out of 4 times, right? Roughly 25% of the time. When the insanity defense does work, meaning under 1% of cases attempt it, of those, only 25% successfully use it. 90% of that 25% of that 1%, okay, so we're talking about, small number here, 90% of that time, the individual who successfully uses the defense had been diagnosed formally with a mental illness before the alleged acts that they have been accused for and the trial in question, right? And part of this has to do with burden of proof. Interesting that this has to do with an assassination attempt against the president, but after Ronald Reagan's attempted assassin was found not guilty by reason of insanity, the burden of proof in an insanity defense shifted to the defense. That's very significant. Normally, in the American justice system, the prosecution has to prove their case before a judge or jury beyond a reasonable doubt, and the defense merely needs to create or point out reasonable doubt in order to, as the law is written, obtain an acquittal, a not guilty verdict. When you put forward an insanity defense, it is the defense attorneys who have to prove with clear and convincing evidence that the person they are defending, that the defendant, is insane, and that insanity exculpates them having committed the crime, legally speaking. And that is really, really tough. The other aspect for this, which is difficult with Trump, or not difficult, but doesn't really align with what we know about him, is that part of the basis for being legally insane relates to being unable to distinguish right from wrong. I don't believe that Donald Trump is unable to distinguish right from wrong. I think Trump knows right from wrong, but his delusional megalomaniac personality makes him think that he's untouchable, right? That he can get away with these things that he probably to some extent realizes aren't okay things to be doing. And that is sort of the opposite of an insanity defense. That is actually something that would be considered an aggravating factor, sort of a total disregard for the rightness or wrongness of action. So really, for a possible successful insanity defense for Trump, and again, this is if at some point it came up, and we have no idea that it ever will, it would probably be only if we had some kind of actual diagnosis that would prove Trump had diminished capacity for understanding the real world, which for Trump really would be dementia or Alzheimer's. Long story short, I think we shouldn't be counting on it. And quite frankly, I think we shouldn't even really be thinking about it. Let's let the investigations happen as they should, as Robert Mueller is carrying them out. And then we'll deal with the consequences if and when we know them. And in the meantime, let's try to keep winning some elections like Democrats were able to do on Tuesday this week. Okay, I'm often asked by callers, by who knows, random people I meet on the street. Anyway, I'm asked, who do I think is really like the worst person in the Trump administration? Who do I really find vile and disgusting, whether it's a current or former Trump official? And when I've been asked this, I've been pretty consistent, right? The most vile, repulsive current or former Trump administration officials for me are Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the current press secretary, Golden Boy and Trump son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Nazi white supremacist linked Sebastian Gorka. Just if you don't remember him, Sebastian Gorka was a Trump advisor. He, by all indications, was pushed out when Chief of Staff John Kelly came in and realized, wait a second, the presence of this guy in our administration is completely toxic. And not surprisingly, Fox News has gone out and they've hired Sebastian Gorka. Sebastian Gorka reportedly has sworn allegiance to the Nazi-allied Hungarian political party. And he has denied this in his defense. Sebastian Gorka has denied this, but the Forward investigated this and found that indeed Gorka appears to be tied to a group called Vitezi Rend, which, according to the American State Department, was under the direction of the German Nazi government during World War II. Not credible that Gorka has denied this, because the Forward really did a good job investigating it. But in his defense, he has denied it. And Sean Hannity had the pleasure of introducing Sebastian Gorka officially to the Fox News audience, saying on a recent show, "Joining us now is Dr. Sebastian Gorka. I can officially announce today he is a Fox News national security strategist." However, not only is Gorka also Nazi linked, it's not really clear that Gorka is actually a national security expert either. There's a funny quote from Politico where they say several experts interviewed by Politico puzzled over the gap between the numerous military academic credentials listed by Gorka, a political science PhD who unfailingly uses the title doctor, and their unfamiliarity with his work and views. Not really shocking, right? Fox News has a very long history of having so-called experts that aren't really experts. Fox News, in hiring Sebastian Gorka, has hired a guy who once defended Donald Trump staying totally silent after a mosque was bombed, because according to Gorka, it's possible that liberals faked that bombing. Gorka also has in his, I guess we would call it an extensive track record of these types of comments. He once asserted that people should really stop criticizing white supremacists so much. So really, it's a perfect fit for Fox News. It's hard to imagine a better hire for them. And I used this phrase yesterday, talking about the Indiana cross-check system, which is inaccurately identifying 99% of the voters to be removed from voter rolls. I said, that's not a bug, that's a feature. In other words, that's exactly what Republicans want the system to be doing, to be disproportionately deregistering non-white voters who are more likely to be Democrats. It applies here, right? Gorka wasn't hired by Fox News despite having this heinous track record of horrible statements and ties to a Hungarian Nazi party. He was hired because those things count as positives if you're being hired by Fox News. And Fox loves these types, right? They hired Oliver North, who gave weapons to Iran, with profits going to drug dealers in Nicaragua. They hired that racist police officer, Mark Furman, who played a role in the now decades-old murder trial of former football player O.J. Simpson. I think maybe they even hired G. Gordon Liddy, although I'm less sure about that one. I'm thinking off the top of my head. Anyway, congrats to Fox News. Congrats to Gorka. Really a match made in heaven, if you believe in that sort of thing, I guess. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. I guess something I must have at some point said about smoking cigarettes led to the following voicemail coming in recently. Take a listen to it.
Hey, David, I want to know if you think smokers is bad people because they don't care if they get cancer or they give cancer to other folks with their cigarettes. Well, that's all I wanted to know, David. You have a great day there.
Yeah. I don't think smokers is bad people. I really don't. I think that smokers is addicted people, and I think that it's an illness, right? You've got an addiction to something that is terrible for you. If you go back to the process of how someone becomes addicted initially, there's nothing in there that would indicate that we're dealing with bad people. I think that it's an issue of addiction. I think that if we were to talk to smokers, I would assume that a really small percentage would say, I'm indifferent to other people getting cancer because of my smoking. I think most of them would say, no, that's not what I want. But we're dealing with addiction here. And I find it to be a vile habit. I hate being around it. And I do everything I can to, if I'm walking on the street and someone in front of me lights up and they start kind of exuding smoke like a chimney, I will immediately just move around them and get away because I want nothing to do with it. But no, I don't think smokers is bad people. On the bonus show today, child sex offenders are going to be named as such in American passports. What do we think about that? Public health groups are in favor of raising the smoking age to 21 years old nationwide. What do we think about that? And another Chris Christie confrontation. No ice cream cone involved in this one, but still an interesting one nonetheless. So all of those stories and more on today's bonus show. 2 ways to get access to the bonus show. Number 1, davidpakman.com/membership. Number 2, patreon.com/David Pakman Show, whichever you use, and I encourage you to use both, by the way. You can do both. We'll talk to you shortly on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.